Good morning, everybody, and thanks for coming to this rather new kind of session topic, I think, here at the HGSA convention. It is called, When Does the Caregiving Stop? I'm Amy Cheshire, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker and help manage our research programs at the University of Rochester, which is a center of excellence for Huntington's disease. And I have the real experts in the room that are joining me today. And I'm probably going to have them maybe just say who you are, just ever so briefly. You want to start, Debbie?
Yep. My name is Debbie Stanley Armistead. My husband Paul has HD, and we live in South Dakota.
I'm Karen Patterson. I live in Baton Rouge, not far from here now, originally from the Midwest. My husband had Huntington's disease, and both of our daughters had it, and they're all gone now.
Okay. All right. So just some disclaimers here. Again, if people want to take a picture using the QR code to evaluate how well we hopefully do today, that'd be great. So I just wanted to start with a few comments about this. There was a lot of discussion about the title of this workshop today, and we're going to kind of delve into it a little bit. So I just wanted to highlight kind of what we often think about when we think about being a care partner, caregiving related to HD, that I tend to think about it, and this isn't just me, but sort of the phases of caregiving that folks can go through. So there's what I affectionately kind of call, or actually more so folks with HD or their care partners have referred to as sort of the honeymoon kind of phase of things, okay? And so this tends to be kind of those early days, and early days I know can mean a lot of different things when it comes to HD, but when I'm talking about early days, it's either many years maybe prior to someone deciding to go through what we call pre-symptomatic genetic testing. So I know I'm at risk, I got a mom or dad with HD, and I want to find out whether or not I've inherited the gene. So sometimes people never get to that point, which is perfectly fine, and other times people get to it and decide they want to do that pretty quickly. So that can be that honeymoon period. Or for folks that didn't go through testing and then unfortunately just start to show symptoms, and that period of time then leading up to the actual, what we call motor diagnosis, meaning people have the physical signs of HD. So this period of time can vary in terms of, how long this sort of honeymoon phase lasts for, if you will. But I just kind of identified what's kind of the main question that's usually sort of percolating around, both for the person with HD and their care partner. And that big question is sort of what's happening here, right? This is maybe obviously not what I'd quite expected. And in particular, I think for the care partner is, what is my role? And especially in these early days, especially I think right after genetic testing and getting a positive result, that in particular spouses often, I think, feel like they don't get a lot of limelight on them. They sort of get lost a little bit in the shuffle. Because obviously there's so much focus on the person that got this positive gene news, right? And so we always try to make an effort to not forget about that sort of other person that's in the room, especially when test results are given, but certainly that first year or two afterwards. So that's kind of this period of just really trying to absorb this all, and what does this mean? And I think this can last for a good couple of years often, this kind of honeymoon phase of things. And then we move into what I affectionately call the sort of messy middle, right? This is where all the hard stuff happens. And again, tends to be the longest phase of caregiving at this point. These are just rough, numbers that I'm using, 10 plus years. And we often, people have probably heard this a lot, talk about HD like a three-legged stool, just to kind of keep it simple in some ways. And so all the legs of the stool at this point are often kind of what I said, kind of breaking down, right? Whether people are having a lot of motor symptoms, or maybe they're having a lot more problems with their thinking and their cognition and their judgment and their impulse, or they're having kind of behavioral issues. So this is really where the thick of it, I think, in particular for everybody, but in particular for care partners, can really be a challenging period. And the big question here is, guess what? Am I going to be able to keep doing this, right? Whether you're kind of saying that or not, it's often kind of playing like background music all the time, right? How bad is it going to get? And am I going to be able to keep doing this? So the caregiver is often thinking in some shape or form about that. The person with HD is thinking about it also in sort of their own way, which is usually a little bit more around how bad is it going to get, and is my care person going to be able to stick around for all of this? So that messy middle, I think, is a really hard period of time for everyone. And then the end is really sort of, I'm using a baseball analogy, bottom of the ninth, is often kind of the shorter phase, but a different and harder phase. So this is really more towards the end of someone's journey with HD. And this can play itself out in a huge amount of different ways. And really the question at this point is a lot of the what ifs can start to surface. And in particular, sometimes some degree of, I'm going to call it regrets. That might be a little harsh word. It's more of a reflection maybe of, could I have done anything else? Was there something I could have done differently? I think of a caregiver, her husband who had taken care of, who had died from Huntington's disease. Her son went on to inherit the disease. And then as he was getting very, very late stages, which was about 1 year into the pandemic, and she really debated about feeling like he needed placement because things were getting so challenging, but then, which did happen, but then, and then he later passed about a year later or so. And I know even talking with her in hindsight, because it was so hard then to see him right during the pandemic and placement, that she still carries a lot of these what ifs. Was that the right decision? Did I do the right thing? Would he have lived longer if I had, these kind of things that are very common, and people need hopefully some kind of environment to be able to express that. So those are just kind of the sort of phases of care partnering. So some of just quickly unique features, and there's a lot of unique things about HD, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of them I think that sort of stand out for me in terms of working with families with HD. Certainly the issue around, and I know Debbie in particular will probably be addressing this, but how does caregiving change when you're place someone, so someone moves outside of the home, whatever that, out of the home community placement, but the dynamic of how, are you still a caregiver? If you are, in what shape or capacity, and how it shifts, and how I think a lot of care partners may not always be so prepared for that shift, and then learning how to navigate that. So I know you'll get to hear right from the experts about that. And then, of course, this ongoing, right, the inheritance of HD changes caregiving compared to caregiving for Alzheimer's disease, caregiving for Parkinson's disease, a lot of these other diseases that may have very rare genetic components to them, but fundamentally different than HD. And so how complicated, and I think there's a whole session here about if you're an at-risk caregiver, right? So this really can change the dynamics in caregiving, especially, and I hear about this a lot, or if someone gets placed at a nursing home, maybe the nursing home staff will say, we don't understand why the family doesn't come around, or, why their sibling isn't coming around. And some of it, it's just, it can be too much looking in the mirror, as I say, right? If I'm at risk for the same darn disease that I'm taking care of my loved one with, that sort of in your face a lot can be hard. Some folks can navigate that well, but it's just a unique piece that many other diseases don't have to contend with. So I think that's an important thing to just always be mindful of. And really managing, I don't know that there's a lot of support for life after Huntington's disease, actually. And I use that term in a lot of different ways. I think it's probably a weaker area, I have to think. I know my care partners have a hard time finding grief groups or support groups like that. Anything that's even remotely similar to HD, like they'll go to general grief groups, but with Huntington's, you're grieving almost the entire duration of the disease. And then someone maybe ultimately passes from the disease, and now you have a different type of grief going on. So I think that's an area that hopefully we can do more on, and hopefully folks will be able to speak to that today. And this last one, which is kind of the focus of this workshop, is what does it mean to not be a care partner anymore, right? This is something that folks often don't think about, but when they are at that point, I remember just real quick, my father died from a struggle with Parkinson's disease, and my mom was his lifelong caregiver. And I remember maybe just a month or so after he had died, and we were out and about, and she was like, just kind of running errands or whatever, and she's like, oh my God, I don't have to run home and make sure, I have something prepared for your dad to eat. And it's just how freeing, but how challenging it is to kind of make that adjustment, right? And what that can kind of bring about. So I think that's more of what we'll be trying to be also kind of addressing a little bit. And maybe you never stop being a care partner, right? So maybe the answer to the question is it never stops. So that's just some kind of general background. And now we're going to move into storytelling, which is a wonderful way to kind of really help better understand people's journeys. So we're going to start with Paul and Debbie. And the way we wanted to do this was I'm just going to have Debbie kind of share sort of her HD story. And as she's doing that, folks have graciously provided some lovely pictures to help try to bring to life a little bit more the people that you're hearing about. So I'll turn it over to Deb.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. My husband, Paul, as I mentioned, has HD, and we met a little later in life, back in our generation. So we were in our 30s, and we met at a wedding. And he was that gorgeous guy that runs in late, and he actually went to the wrong small town for the church. And I was living far away from my friends, and I came in hot too, and I'm like, I am never going to date another guy again. I just have to say that just to lighten it up a little bit so I don't cry. But anyways, so we met at this wedding, and from that point on, we just were together all the time. And, another funny story is, how all the family members do the clink, clink, clink for the bride and the groom, and the moms and the dads and the grandpas and grandmas. Well, for somehow this group of people did clink, 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 Paul and Deb. And I was like, I've only known you 10 minutes. I can't kiss you. But anyway, so we've been together ever since. A year and a half later, we got married. And about a year later, Paul was deployed to Iraq. I'll tell you, though, the first weekend that I met him, he told me right away about his mom having HD. Yeah. And at that time, I don't think there was Google, or at least I didn't know how to get into it, or the internet. And so everything that I would research going to the library, it was always about movement. There wasn't anything about cognitive judgment, those kinds of things. But yeah, then Paul was deployed. So we got married in 2001. He was deployed in 2003, came home in 2005. 2006, when he came home, we knew something was wrong. Something was up. Because Paul was very, very athletic. He lived in a small town, so I think there was a graduation class of like 30. So he was in every sport, and he still holds 2 track records in his little high school in South Dakota. And that's how people described Paul. Paul could do anything. Paul was a superhero. He was a Superman. And if he had never done it, he'd give it a shot. Without any training, he would just say, like, I can do that. In his days of being in the guards, in the Army Guards, his mentality on the PT test was, let's just get this done. Let's just get this done. And all the others would be like, Augie, you're killing us. You're setting the pace. Don't run or sprint it. Set the pace for us people who need the help. And he's like, no, I want to get this run done. I want to get my push-ups done. I want to get all this other stuff done and just move on with the day. And so he was that rock star. He was that rock star. So when he came home from Iraq, he started falling. We'd be going to Home Depot or Fleet Farm, and we'd be walking in, and I'd feel this like, and then pop up. And I was like, did you just fall down? He goes, I think so. And then we'd go and we'd do yard work. He actually accidentally mowed the neighbor's T-shirt. Well, it was his fault for putting it by the border, right? But anyways, that T-shirt just, and Paul came in, he goes, I don't think I should mow the lawn anymore. I just mowed somebody's T-shirt. I said, well, I don't think his T-shirt should have been right by where your lawnmower was. But so then I had to mow the lawn forever. But he would fall off of ladders. We had our master suite was upstairs, and he would just he would trundle down it. It wasn't like Paul, because Paul was water skiing. He would do air chair. He would slalom ski. That was Paul. And when we were dating and we were playing like flag football or softball, I think he almost broke up with me because he found out I wasn't athletic. And he says, is that really you, or are you just messing around? And I said, what do you mean? He goes, you're not very athletic. And I'm like, I am not, but I'm funny. And he goes, okay. So anyways, so in 2006, after we got some things in order financially and life insurance and long-term care insurance, we decided that he would get tested. And it took us a while because he was at the Sioux Falls VA, and when he came home from Iraq, they had to do all the ending tests, or the post-deployment testing and all that. And they did see some things that were different from all of Paul's other testing before any of his deployments. So the neurologist did see something. He could see that he wasn't tracking and some of those kinds of things. And it took us a while to find somebody that would test us. We finally got to the psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist said, it seems like you've been all over the building. So do you want to get tested? And Paul's like, yes. And I think we kind of knew what the result was going to be. So that was hard. That was hard. Paul was a union plumber. He built homes. And so he was up at 4 o'clock driving across Minneapolis and to get to the job site, and he'd be the first one on, the first one off. He'd come home. We had our first home. We would lay sod. We would put a sprinkler system in. Like, there was no bloody ending to our day. And I wouldn't say when he was diagnosed that it stopped abruptly, but I definitely think his energy and his spirits kind of stopped a little bit. Rightfully so, right? We don't have kids, which is kind of a story in itself, but we don't have kids. But we have a golden doodle, so that's basically a kid, and it almost cost as much as a kid. So yeah, that's Paul right there, obviously.
Is that it? Okay, all right.
I could go on forever.
Okay. All right, we'll turn it over to Karen.
Well, I, in the past, knew nothing about Huntington's disease. It was not something I'd heard of. I went to the University of Michigan to school, and I met my husband there. He was cute and clever, and we clicked. He was British. I had traveled for a class in Europe one summer and kind of fell in love with everything British, and so that might have been a factor. But within a couple of years, we were married, and life was good at that point. For our wedding, his parents couldn't come to the wedding because his father had a neurological illness and couldn't travel. And I think his family in England, if they had heard the diagnosis of Huntington's, they rejected it. So, and I'm not sure what Neil knew about Huntington's. That's Neil at Cambridge. He was a smart guy. He was a Cambridge Trinity College scholar, so he was interesting. We moved to Baton Rouge, where Neil took a job at LSU, and at that point, everything was good. We enjoyed outdoor activities and sailing and so forth, and gardening. And that's our wedding in a small church in Iowa, where I grew up, in a rural area. In a few years, we had our first daughter, Catherine, and everything was good at that point. And it was easier to manage with one child. Eventually, Anne was born, our younger daughter, and at that point, Neil started to change. And gradually his behavior and acting out a bit, strange changes to me that I didn't understand. And if he knew about his father's illness, that may have been a factor. He was diagnosed before there was a test. The genetic test had not been developed. But I think based on his father's diagnosis, he was diagnosed with Huntington's disease, and there wasn't much help available. We didn't have a support group or much knowledge, really. And so that was a difficult period to adjust to. This is Catherine on the left, and Anne, my younger daughter. Anne was more like me, quiet, and easier for me to understand. Kathy was very social, and that's Kathy with her best friend, Beth, who's here at the convention. Beth, in Kathy's honor, started our first walk, Team Hope Walk, back in 2009, and we've continued to have the walk every year. And Beth is more and more committed, I would say, to Huntington's leadership and activities. Anne may have had the juvenile form. She was on the cusp, and she lived with Huntington's for 10 years. And I became the family support. So I was working, and eventually she was in a nursing home. But, on the second try, we found a place where the staff was good and she fit in and was comfortable, and she had a roommate who was very different than she was, but they bonded. Her roommate was paralyzed from a stroke when she was 25, but they became like sisters. And I had two friends, new friends really. They were LSU professors who started visiting Anne every week, and they continued today to visit her roommate Teal, which I think is amazing. And I don't have family in Baton Rouge. This is Anne at one of the 2 Team Hope walks she attended. So I didn't have family support, but I have a great church, and they really rallied around us because they could see a need, and they visited Anne all the time. And at her first nursing home, they were not very helpful on feeding because she was having difficulty. So a friend organized someone to go help her with meals every day, and that nursing home was not a good fit. So we finally found a better place for her, and she died in 2011, in spring of 2011. And she kept a positive attitude, a sense of humor. She remembered people's birthdays. It was quite remarkable how she held on to that. She had a lot of grace and dignity, I felt. Kathy was the more independent, stubborn. Well, they were both stubborn, but outgoing, or at least social, maybe not so outgoing. But her dad had grown up on the North Sea and loved water, and we used to vacation in Pensacola, and that was a happy time. And Kathy moved to Pensacola to be close to the water, and she was happy there. It's a nice, not a huge place, but it meant caregiving was complicated. So I ended up driving to Pensacola every week or two, which it gets hard after a while. And I finally retired, and I got to a point where I wasn't sure I could keep doing it, particularly in our summer heat. If you've been outside, you've noticed it's not comfortable, and helping her was took a lot of strength and energy. And but she lived with her, at one point, 3 dogs. She had been a vet tech, and she loved her animals, and she eventually was down to 1 Cocker Spaniel, very sweet but badly behaved Cocker Spaniel. But she probably needed more assistance than she was getting, but she was not agreeable to that. And finally, she would fall occasionally, and at one point, she had too many falls where she hit her head, and she developed a hematoma, and that's really what caused her death, was the brain bleed. And I didn't mention that Anne didn't exactly die of Huntington's disease. She was in a nursing home, but she had agitation, and she had a little too much medication to subdue the agitation, and after a second shot, her heart stopped, and so she died very suddenly. But neither girl really went through the last stages of Huntington's, and it was a shock for me that I wasn't prepared in either case, and yet you don't know what to wish for with Huntington's. Do you wish for them to linger? So it's a little bit unusual and hard when you hope you outlive your children, because I wanted to be there to help them. So.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
one thing I'll
Oh, yeah.
say is I'm very much now in the what am I if I'm not a caregiver stage. I don't know.
All right, great. Thank you both. So I have a couple of questions for you all, and then we're going to open it up for hopefully some dialogue or any questions from the audience. Because this comes up a fair amount, what do you wish you had kind of known from the very beginning about Huntington's that you really only came to understand kind of later on? Is there anything that stands out for either of you?
For me, I would say the cognitive and some of the poor judgment situations, because there was a time when Paul wanted to get the deal at Menards and Home Depot, and he already had those credit cards. And so he opened up credit cards in my name. And I was like, what? We already have a card. He goes, yeah, but I wanted the 11%. And I'm like, are you kidding me? And it's a big deal. But I tell you, that wasn't like Paul. That wasn't like Paul when I met him, because he was a saver. And so, he even's like, to me, you'd be, well, maybe that was an indication, but he saved his money, not to go buy something. It was to save it actually in a savings account or an IRA or something like that. So there was that. Paul really was never mad. He never really got mad or agitated until he moved to a nursing home, and that's when he got mad. Because when he moved to the nursing home, all he wanted was a bath in that big jacuzzi tub, which I promised him that he would get because they promised me he would get every day. And that didn't happen. So he was only in a nursing home from October to February, and then I had to take him to the VA, to the ER at the VA, and they actually admitted him into hospice. And at that point, we were changing way too many meds. That was the other thing is I was just looking for doctors to help, and instead we needed one team versus the psychiatrist on 5th floor, and then the neurologist on the 1st floor, and then the primary care on the 3rd floor, and then not to mention the doctor and the CNP and the PA on Paul's floor. Everybody was changing meds the first 6 weeks that he was at the VA. So I would say understanding the cognitive and that piece of it, and how to take control of telling the doctors that you know more than they do. Now I can do it, but when you're watching your husband when this was just in 2016, having hallucinations because the meds are all messed up, is really scary. And the only way to get him to calm down is you're climbing on top of his bed, holding him with all your might and saying, Paulie, it's okay, and I did. I blew up at a doctor, and he goes, why do you think Paul's doing this? Why do you think we have a code man every day? I said, because we're changing his meds all the time. We're changing it every day. And he's like, I have not changed his meds every day. And I'm like, yeah, but you got, hey, do. And finally a nurse said, you know what? Look at the chart. So, and when I take control, it gets a little messy sometimes. But I will say now, yeah. I will say now, we got past those first 6 or 8 weeks, and Paul is still alive. And I didn't think I was going to have him back in 2016. He graduated out of hospice. We have a very extensive care plan. He is very, very late stage. He's not walking. He's eating pureed food. And he has a hard time getting words out. There's a couple words that are always easy to get out, but he has a hard time getting some words out. But he talks with his eyes. I mean, we are a much better place than the first nursing home, and I think you also have to, like I said, take control and say, no, this care plan is going to be with these doctors and these nurses on this floor. Nobody from upstairs, nobody from downstairs is going to help with this. And that was a big deal. And Paul is thriving for being late stage. He's happy. Paul got COVID twice. He also got influenza on New Year's Eve. And the nurses didn't tell me this until later, but they really felt that even Paul was going to die on New Year's Eve. And but he came back. I mean, there is a lot of love there, so we are fortunate. But it was a little bumpy in the beginning. But he's still at the VA. He was actually, and our VA in Sioux Falls does not have a long-term care piece of it, but he was grandfathered in, and so he's now he's one of two long-term care veterans that are on his floor. So on his floor, there's 30 vets, one doctor, one PA, one nurse practitioner. The pharmacist, no med change happens until we do a consult with the pharmacist. And there's 5 RNs and 4 LPNs at a given day. And so his doctor comes into his room 3 or 4 times a day just to visit with Paul. So life is different. It's not pretty there. It's not a pretty place, like some nursing homes, but there's a lot of love there for all of us.
And I would say also the cognitive and behavioral changes at the beginning, before the diagnosis, for me were the hardest. You just don't understand what's happening, and you get input that often isn't correct, that it might be alcoholism or various things. So it and all through the stages where they're functioning in a different way, the behavior can get very difficult. The shopping and the perseveration and just things that you kind of never imagined coping with, really. So, and not that the physical part is not difficult too. And Anne was little, and she got rather thin, and sometimes at home she would fall, and if her hip hit the wall, I had about 3 good-size holes in the sheetrock where Anne would fall into the wall, and I called her my little wrecking ball, and she was still small enough I could lift her and things, and I was younger then too. So the thing I appreciate about this convention and support groups is that there's such a common understanding. You don't have to explain Huntington's, and that's rare. And even your friends who are supportive and wonderful don't understand living with it. And people who live with it know.
Right, they do know. Okay, how about best piece of advice you ever received about HD caregiving, and how about the worst piece of advice? Don't be shy.
Well,
You do that one first.
this may be facetious, but I have friends who told me you have to have a plan, and the company I work for, you have everything, you plan for contingencies. Well, up to a point that makes sense, but planning for Huntington's disease doesn't seem to work the same way. My personal advice is that you have to keep a sense of humor. If you keep laughing, it helps. And the caregiver has to stay flexible because every day can be different.
I think the best piece of advice, which it was hard for me to take the time, was to take care of myself. You know, carve out that day. If it's a half an hour in the morning and a half an hour in the afternoon or at night, or it's 10 minutes here, 10 minutes there, 10 minutes there, carve it out and do something that brings joy to you. That was hard because when we moved to Sioux Falls, it was all about Paul. You know, the worst piece of advice, I think a couple of people said to me, you can't do that because you have to take care of Paul. And I was like, really? No, you can't do that because you have to take care of Paul.
So some shaming, it sounds
Yeah.
like. Yeah, yeah, okay. All right, well, I'm kind of recognizing our time, so I had some other things, but is anyone, any comments or questions that any of you all have for any of these fine women? And I'll just repeat your question, so for the taping. Go ahead. Yes, you are.
You can do it.
I have more of a comment, like it goes to what they're saying, and like you're asking the best and worst information. I think as caregivers, they never say this is, because when you ask a question, the answer's always, there's no norm to having kids. So they never have an answer until you say, this is happening. They're like, oh yeah, that's happening. This is happening, that's happening. Like the financial part. You know, like, I came home from work. I'm from Pittsburgh, Steeler fans. My husband's like, I bought season tickets to the Browns game. I'm like, what are you doing? I mean, that was like my light bulb. Like, okay, no more. You cannot touch our finances because we would never even go there. Like, but it was a good deal because we could resell them, you know. And just like with the credit card, like taking out, like they don't warn us of that. The things that we could do to protect. Because if we don't have anything to care for them with, because it's all gone, what do we do?
Right, so so if I can try to paraphrase that maybe for you. So it sounds like it would have been nice, let me put it that way, to have a little bit more warning, that's your word, to kind of know more about, in particular, kind of more the sort of, I'm going to call them kind of behavioral, impulsive, not being able to really think things out. Like you didn't really get, do you think if you'd, well, let me not ask you a question. So you didn't really feel like you got enough, it would have been nice to get more warning about the potential for these things to happen? Is that kind of right?
I would talk outside of all the sessions, and everyone has the same experience, you know. And I'm like, why isn't there like when you go to your first appointment, they pull the caregiver aside because a lot of times we feel guilty talking in front of our loved one. And why don't they say, we need to talk to you, like these are things that you're going to look for in the next 5 to 10 years. Like this is what's happening, so we're not reacting.
Yeah. Right. It would be nice to know that my credit card wouldn't have been maxed out.
I think we have.
As a warning, guess what, you know?
Right.
Do
either of you want to comment?
I think that's where we have to keep telling our story, our part of the story.
Because, you know, just getting the diagnosis, and if there's a few cognitive, but mostly motor skills that are challenged, our loved one is still a high-functioning person in terms of their workplace or their athleticism. So our trust is still there. And it's not that I don't want to trust Paul, but I was, you know, yeah, he wanted to buy a boat, and all of a sudden he bought, you know, life jackets. I'm like, well, we don't even have the boat yet. And I don't even want to have a boat. I don't know how to drive a boat. He goes, I'll teach you. I'm like, you're the last person who should teach me to ride or drive a boat. You know, but we put so much trust, and I think we just have to keep telling that story, our own stories, and maybe a piece of our care teams will develop that, you know, in our social worker settings.
Right, and I think you bring up a good point about being able to be pulled aside, right? Because even in the early days, it can be very hard to really openly maybe even bring up your own questions or fears. But I think that was a great point too. Did you want to say something, Karen?
Yes, I just want to mention I have 2 sailboats in my backyard that I didn't buy.
Another comment, when you
Yeah.
talked about the medication, my husband, I took him to Pittsburgh to Dr. Valerie Susky, who is an absolute amazing person. And in the process, we found out he had MS on top of it. And she said, I will handle everything. I had one doctor. She did all the antipsychotics, she did all, like she went to the MS doctor. I never met the MS doctor. She did everything. And if I ever had a question, I called, he got chucked the nurse. He's like, oh my God, Christy, like I would call and he's like, we'll get that right to the pharmacy. Like they trusted my judgment because we live it. And I hear a lot of other places like, you know, they're, like my brother-in-law, I mean, my whole family had Huntington's, and their doctors are like, they won't even give us medication for antipsychotics. And how are you even on these? I'm like, because my doctor listens, and she's amazing. And I had one doctor covering 2 horrible diseases, and she was phenomenal. And that made my life way easier, and coping with all of everything, it made our relationship. He didn't have all those outbursts and everything because the medication was controlled almost on a weekly basis. And it was just amazing. And I mean, he was there to the end. He's been a year and a half with the kids. It's just, that made life easier. You know, so to be able to like have that and like be able to adjust quickly and not go through some of the things. Like my sister-in-law, when she went into the hospital, they stripped her of all her medicines to see, let's see what works now. It's like, that's abuse. Like, who does that? So I was very fortunate to have an amazing doctor.
Right, no, it sounds like it.
You know, I appreciate you telling that story because I met somebody out in the hallway and they said, you know, my husband has team whatever. So yeah, we have team Paul, right? Team Paul. And we as caregivers need to reach out and create team Debbie, right? Get team Debbie. And then Debbie and Paul. So we've got a lot of teams that we're managing, but you really do have to search out those people that will listen to you and want to ask you compelling questions so that you pull the information out of your inner heart and your inner brain of like, this is really what's happening at home.
And I think like getting on like depression medicine ahead of the movements, and it helps, I think, them get used to, people with Huntington's get used to being on medication. Because there's a lot of people that I talk to, they're like, no, they're not on that medication, they don't want it. But we wanted to have children and we didn't want to pass on the gene, so we found out ahead of time, way before he showed any symptoms, that he was going to be sick, so we could make sure we didn't pass it on. And from that day, he found out, he just found, he wasn't even depressed. He's like, the doctor's like, let's just put you on the lowest dose, so we just in case. And he got off of it for 4 months. He switched PCPs, like, and we had the worst 4 months of our lives. Like, police were there, and I was like, what's going on? And he was like, I'm not on any medication. I was like, the next day, he got back. I'm like, I'm actually like in the process of like, I was leaving you because you're being abusive to me. He got back on it, and the next 10 years, nothing ever happened like that again. So the medication is huge, and I don't know, like, it's almost like it needs to be preemptive instead of reactive. And I struggle with it. It doesn't get out there enough.
Right.
Any other comments? I had one final question for folks, so.
I just have a question.
Yeah.
So, my daughter-in-law, my son and their child both have Huntington's. So my daughter-in-law had the idea that she needed to take care of both of them at the same time and not take care of herself because they were at number one. And it took her a long time to make that decision to, only her husband, my son, into a facility.
Mm-hmm.
Because she said, no, I can do it, I can take care of him, that was my promise to him. At what point and how did you go about making that decision? best for them.
Well,
So
from
let
a-
me, oh, sorry, Karen, before, I just, so the question is kind of what kind of went into, how did you, make a decision about moving towards some type of placement? Go ahead.
With my younger daughter, sweet as she could be, and I think the medication is better now than when my family went through this, but there were times when even with help at home, it got to be too hard to manage, and I was working, and it got to a point where we couldn't control little Ann, and if we have time for a story, I one time went to an LSU football game in the evening. Ann was in her nightgown. She'd had her medicine at night. And she got mad that I went to the game without her. And she found the keys to my car. She had not driven in 6 years or so. And it was in a garage at the back of the property. She managed to back the car out of the driveway. I'm sure scraped it some. She was going to go back to New Orleans, where she had lived and had fun. And the police, she'd had medication. I'm sure she was weaving. The police saw her and tried to stop her. And I think just before she got on the interstate, I think they probably forced the car into a ditch. It totaled the car. She was okay, and she had her handicap hang tag. She was barefoot and in a nightgown, and they took her to a state police headquarters, and her sitter was oblivious that she had left. And it was a comedy of errors, but when we finally found out, I came home, the car was gone, everybody was gone, and we started calling and found out where she was. And I talked to a police lieutenant who said, "You really shouldn't let her drive."
Good point.
So, anyway, I forget.
That's so great. I think, EJ, for me, it was the hardest decision I ever had to make. Paul was falling a lot. And of course, we have ceramic everywhere, ceramic and wood floors everywhere, and he was just falling a lot. And so we made that decision together. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, yeah. So I guess the big question we started the session with, maybe we should end with, do you feel like caregiving ever does stop or end?
I'll start. No. No. Even though Paul's in a long-term care facility, I'm still his care I still care for him. I'm not helping him going to the bathroom, but yes, sometimes I am when I'm there. I do still feed him. I still go visit the doctor every day because I go see Paul every day. So just because he's not in our home, I'm still there. And I still get grumpy, and I still advocate, and I still praise, and I still take him lunch, and the workers and the medical teams, but that part doesn't change. So it doesn't mean just because he's not in our same home, he's still number one, my number one focus. Now, we have 2 nieces and a nephew at risk, so we will see, I guess.
Well, as I said, my family, have died. And I've struggled with this question. I don't have all the answers. I do help facilitate a small support group in Baton Rouge. And, I want to help whenever, I encounter Huntington's families. But it's a hard question, I think, to know who you are. I was a caregiver, I don't know, between 30 and 40 years. And I'm still struggling with that question. I'm not sure.
Okay, great. All right. Well, this is one of my favorite Theodore Roosevelt quotes. And I just want to thank you both tremendously, Karen and Debbie, for being so vulnerable and courageous in sharing your story. And I'm sure that it resonated with everyone. So thank you again for sharing this little hour, and keep carrying on. All right. Thank you.